Thank you so much for coming to my workshop, How to Memorize Music with Intentionality. So we're going to explore how our brains memorize, and then we'll use that information to help us and our students be more efficient in how we learn music. And then we'll workshop using your new piece as well. So if at any point you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and stop me along the way. So knowing a piece without reliance on the score is one of the most enjoyable experiences as a musician. You can look at your hands, you can experiment with different touches, listen more carefully to your playing, and have enough solidity with a piece to be spontaneous and imaginative. As living beings, we are constantly absorbing and memorizing everything around us, making connections with people and experiences. And learning music is no different. Our brains begin to memorize both consciously and unconsciously from the moment that we first interact with a new piece. Our ears start to memorize how the notes sound, our fingers start to form habits in which fingerings to use, and our eyes begin to see patterns in how things look on the score and on the keyboard. Making music is a unique experience because it involves nearly every region of our brain. In this workshop, we'll focus on the regions associated with feel or muscle memory, hearing, and also our sight. The brain's first step to memorize sound actually happens in the unconsciousness. So here, the ear converts sound into trains of nerve impulses sent to the brain to form an echoic memory. Then the brain extracts features and binds them into auditory events. And this whole process is done unconsciously. And before we're even aware of it, our brains are already processing and memorizing the piece that we just started to practice. As we practice, connections are made between cells in the brain, and myelin wraps around the circuitry as an insulator. Myelin is like electrical tape wrapped around wire. It makes the signal faster and prevents leakage. Whenever an action is repeated, more layers of myelin are added to make that connection in your brain stronger and more automatic. Every time you practice deeply, the wires of your brain get faster. Over time, signal speeds increase to 200 miles per hour from 2 miles per hour. When you practice, it's useful and motivating to visualize the pathways of your brain being transformed from simple copper wires to high-speed broadband, because that's what's really happening. Practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes myelin, and myelin makes perfect. It's important to know that myelin wraps, but it doesn't unwrap. So in other words, our brains are good at building connections, but they're not good at unbuilding them. So this is why precision especially matters early on. The first repetitions are like the first sled tracks on fresh snow. On subsequent tries, your sled will tend to follow those grooves. So if you build the right pathway now, you'll save yourself a lot of time and trouble down the line. Therefore, we want to treat learning new pieces as a long-term investment, for good or for bad, with the number one goal of a new piece to make deep connections in your brain that will put you on the right track, knowing that anything you do now will become your brain's default for future practice. So this means resisting the temptation to sloppily sight read a new piece, which can give the illusion of mastery. And instead, we want to focus on connecting the right wires in our brain by being accurate and alert to errors, like a careful carpenter. So think like a gardener and work like a carpenter. Think patiently without judgment, work steadily, strategically, knowing that each piece connects to a larger whole. So for young students, I've found it helpful to turn the learning process of a new piece into a game so that they're more motivated to play accurately. So we're actually going to play this game together. So I call it the bean game because completing each step will gain students a bean, and then a certain number of beans will gain them a reward, which could be 15 minutes of TV, candy, or anything that you or the parent decides is good. So in order to make the first repetitions of a new phrase as accurate as possible, I have students isolate the rhythm, notes, and fingering before putting it together. So first I have them choose a new phrase, and then tap the rhythm using the index fingers of both hands on the piano lid. So you would shade your piano lid, and then your right hand would tap the treble clef, and your left hand tap the bass clef. And then I have them find the correct notes, and then put the correct notes with the correct rhythm. Then choose the fingerings. Then play the correct notes, fingerings, and rhythms. And then the final step is to play the correct notes, fingering, rhythms with the right articulations and dynamics as well. So the goal of each step is to make the right connections in the brain, which means playing slowly and then focusing on accuracy. And I like to use the analogy of a hand-cranked music box. As long as everything is in its right place, then you can always speed it up later. So now I'm going to give all of you a chance to play the bean game and pretend like you're the student, just so you understand the game. So go ahead and take out your new piece or a new phrase that you haven't learned yet, and then you can go through these steps, and you'll notice you have a thing of beans next to you. And then for every step you complete, then you can get one of the beans. And just remember that the goal is accuracy and not speed. And then at the end I have some rewards. Oops.
So you want us to do the steps, right? And tap
Yeah.
the rhythm first.
So first you'll close your piano lid and tap the rhythm. So you're going to pretend like you're the student and like that you need each step to be done isolated because you aren't able to put all of it together first. So first you'll use your right hand to tap the treble clef and your left hand to tap the bass clef. Just the rhythms. Yeah, so you can kind of and you don't have to worry about like the fingering or notes or anything in the first step. Just the rhythm.
Get a beat, right?
Yay! already finished your phrase, you can move on to a new phrase while the others finish up. So I'll just give you a few more minutes. Huh?
I've always wanted to play this, but I never did.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just have us move on, but hopefully that was enough time to give you an idea of what the game kind of feels like, so you could play this or have your play this with your students or have their parents play this with them. So now that your student has accurately played one phrase, they're ready to make it fluent through repetition. One of the most fulfilling moments of a practice session is when you have your first perfect rep. When this happens, freeze. Rewind the mental tape and play the move again in your mind. Memorize the feeling, the rhythm, the physical and mental sensations. The point is to mark this moment. This is the spot where you want to go again and again. It's not the finish line, it's the new starting line for perfecting this skill until it becomes automatic. So let's look at what happens in the brain when we repeat a phrase many times to make it more automatic. So like mentioned before, our brains memorize unconsciously the things around us, including the sound our ears pick up. So can everyone see these tiny dots in the background? So the density of tiny dots represents the unconsciousness, where our mind processes sounds and stores long-term memories. You'll notice that there are fewer dots up top, which represents our conscious awareness. Here our brains can memorize more actively by bringing something into our conscious and rehearsing it over and over again. So this is a close-up of our conscious mental state when we're actively memorizing. So STM stands for short-term memory, which can be thought of as activated memories that are immediately available to our conscious awareness, whereas long-term memories are in an unconscious state. So you'll notice semi-activated long-term memories moving into consciousness with arrows from long-term to short-term memory, and then also semi-activated long-term memories moving out of consciousness with arrows from short-term memory into long-term memory. So this is showing how memories in our conscious awareness affect our long-term memories, while our long-term memories also affect what we perceive in our conscious awareness. In other words, Our unconscious memories influence what we choose to memorize. A large percentage of the long-term memory remains unconscious, although it has a large effect in guiding what we are conscious of. What we already know literally determines what we see and hear, which means that we see and hear what we look for more than what we look at. Or said another way, new memories are built up largely out of the elements of older memories. Even quite novel events are usually experienced as deviations within some kind of framework of pre-existing knowledge. If we do not have such a framework within which to frame an experience, for example, hearing a complex piece of music in a style about which we know nothing, we are not likely to remember much about it. Another way of saying this is that everything is experienced and remembered as part of a context. So with our past experiences and knowledge heavily shaping how we memorize new material, it's an important reminder to us as teachers to expose our students to lots of different styles and composers so that they can have a comprehensive framework from which to learn new material. So we've looked at how long-term memories influence what is perceived in our conscious, and now we want to understand how to make what is in our conscious awareness stick in our long-term memory, and this is where repetition comes in. In conscious memorization, information is recirculated repeatedly or rehearsed through the focus of conscious awareness and short-term memory. So here, this rehearsal is represented by the dotted lines. This rehearsal greatly increases the chances that the information being recirculated in short-term memory will cause modifications in permanent long-term memory. The longer the contents of short-term memory are kept active, the more likely they are to persist as long-term memory. So through conscious repetition, we strengthen a memory circuitry in the brain so that it's easier to recall from long-term memory and then becomes more automatic. So therefore, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So now we're going to add repetition as the next step in the bean game. So we want to repeat the phrase over and over until a circuitry in our brain becomes more automatic. So to promote accuracy while doing this, students, they can get 3 beans if they play their new phrase with the correct notes, fingering, rhythm, articulations, and dynamics 2 times in a row. So as they repeat the phrase, it's important to also be alert to fixing mistakes right away. Mistakes aren't really mistakes. They're the information you use to build the right links. The more you pay attention to mistakes and fix them, the more of the right connections you'll be building inside your brain. Visualizing this process as it happens helps you reinterpret mistakes as what they actually are, tools for building skill. So to encourage students to stop and fix mistakes, they can also earn a bean each time they isolate a mistake and then play it correctly 2 times in a row. So I'll give you another few minutes to keep playing the bean game by repeating your phrase and fixing mistakes. Or if you didn't get to that step yet, that's okay. Just keep working wherever you are at. Okay, so I think we will keep moving now. So once your student feels comfortable playing their phrase accurately, you can challenge them to look at their hands more and more to increase the difficulty. So you want them to stay in the sweet spot where they're always at the edge of their abilities and embracing struggle. It's been proven that trying to solve a problem before being taught the solution leads to better learning, even when errors are made in the attempt. And this is because unsuccessful attempts to solve a problem encourage deep processing of the answer when it is later supplied, creating fertile ground for its encoding in a way that simply reading the answer cannot. So in our case, the music score is like our answer key. So by looking at our hands instead of first relying on the score right away, then we're trying to find the answer in our brain before being given the solution. So in this process of attempt and struggle, then we will flex our brain's muscles. And our brains work just like our muscles. No pain, no gain. So in this next step of the bean game, you can test yourself by looking at your hands while playing the phrase, and then just know that each attempt and struggle is helping to make the connections in your brain stronger. So I will give you a few more minutes to try this next step. Yeah. And the point is that it should feel difficult, so if it does, then that's a good thing. And if you weren't able to get through the other steps to play the phrase accurately, you could just take like the first measure and try to look at your hands, or just a part of it. Okay, so let's keep moving. So hopefully you felt the difficulty in your brain's muscles. So after doing all of this, if after your student has done all these steps, then they're ready to learn more phrases and piece them together in context, which would be the next step in the bean game. So as you learn more phrases and group them together into larger sections, your brain will form various levels of grouping to structure the memory of the music. So the more you play a piece of music, the more your brain will find patterns and groupings to help organize all the information. So notes are chunked into notes are grouped into chunks, and then chunks into phrases, then phrases into sections, and sections into multi-sections. The brain thinks of each group as a whole rather than thinking of its individual elements, which helps to reduce the amount of information the brain has to store. So this is important because our brain's short-term memory is limited to only about 7 different elements at any given time. However, one element can consist of more than one item. For example, to remember this string of 16 numbers, we don't have to actually remember 16 different digits when we realize that we can think of it as 4 different dates. We then reduce 16 elements to only 4. So this is how grouping saves memory space in our brain. Our short-term memory is also limited by time length. So musical groupings are often created by composers so as to fit within the limitations of short-term memory, thus giving their music a clearer and more memorable structure. The level of musical grouping which is most directly related to short-term memory is the phrase. So you might be wondering, how can we memorize larger pieces if our short-term memory is limited to only one phrase? So while our short-term memory has limitations, our long-term memory has a vast amount of storage space from which our short-term memory can pull from. So the trick is to have strong cues in between phrases, so that the end of one phrase will give a cue for which phrase our brain needs to recall next, and then the end of that phrase will cue to the next, and so forth. Therefore, our ability to memorize large works is dependent on having groupings and then having strong cues for recalling those groupings. Danielle Levitin put it this way: every experience is potentially encoded in memory. The barrier to being able to recall everything we might want to is not that it wasn't stored in memory then. Rather, the problem is finding the right cue to access the memory and properly configure our neural circuits. The more we access a memory, the more active become the retrieval and recollection circuits, and the more facile we are with the cues necessary to get at the memory. In theory, if we only had the right cues, we could access any past experience. So to make sure that the cue for recalling each phrase of a piece is stable, you can test yourself by making sure you can start from each phrase of a piece by memory. You can think of musical groupings like beads on a string, where each bead connects to the ones around it. But then what happens when one of the beads falls off of the string? Then all of the other beads after it, they will also fall. And this is the same phenomenon that a musician has when they have a memory slip, and then they forget what comes after as well. So to prevent this from happening, you can group beads together by tying knots so that everything will stay in place more independently. Grouping music into parts that our brains can recall with stability is similar to tying knots in a string of beads. The more knots you tie to form more groups of beads, the more stable the string of beads will be. And likewise, the more groupings you form in music, the more stable the music will be situated in your memory. And this is why memorizing several different starting places within a difficult phrase solidifies our memory. Each starting place is like tying a knot in the string of music. So, as the last activity for today, I want you to choose a difficult phrase in your memorized piece. So if you want to get out your memorized piece, find a place where you have trouble with the memory, and then I want you to choose a starting place in the middle of that phrase, and then practice starting from that abnormal spot in the middle. So I will give you a few more minutes, or a few minutes to do that. So did everyone find a phrase that they have difficulty to remember sometimes? Yeah, and then just make sure that you choose a place within that phrase that you don't normally start at. So something new that feels awkward to start at, and then we'll try to make it feel more stable, but kind of like tying a knot. Okay, so I think that's all the time we have for today. So on Wednesday, we will start by trying to start from that same place that you just chose in your difficult phrase and see if we can also start there again on Wednesday if you remember how to start there. And then we will continue working with your memorized piece. So thank you for coming today.
Where would you like us to put the bean?
Oh, right. And also, for every 3 beans you got, you can have a treat. So you can bring them here.
Are we all done with the beans, or do you want us to save them over?
Oh, yeah, we're done with the beans, so you don't need them on Wednesday.
Okay.
Yeah, I will put the. Yeah, you can deposit your beans and then trade them for candy.